pursuant to Standing Order 108(2) and the motions adopted by the committee on Thursday, March 3rd, 2022, the committee is resuming its study of the assessment of Canada's security posture in relation to Russia. With us today, as an individual, Dr. Ken Barker, Professor, Institute for Security, Privacy and Information Assurance, University of Calgary; Juliette K.M., Belfer Senior Lecturer in International Security, Harvard Kennedy School of Government; and from Beauceron Security, David Shipley, Chief Executive Officer. Welcome to all of you. I will be asking you to make a 5-minute opening statement. When you have 30 seconds left, you've got this to see, and I'm pretty strict about time, to be fair to everybody. So I will now like to invite Dr. Ken Barker to make an opening statement. Sir, the floor is yours whenever you're ready. You're on mute, Mr. Barker.
Okay, there, that should be working now.
It is.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's my pleasure to join you today. I'm going to probably say some things here that are maybe a little bit different than what you might be expecting from a security expert. And specifically, I'm going to talk about the cyber attack vulnerabilities really have not changed since the start of the Russia-Ukraine war. So what I'm talking about is the vulnerabilities haven't changed, not necessarily the threat posture. So basically, exactly the same threats exist now that were actually available before. And the Russians are unlikely to have gotten any better at their attacks in the last 2 months, or with the onset of the Russian-Ukraine war. So really nothing's changed. So what's going on with Canada's vulnerability? As an energy producer, Canada is likely to be more targeted by an attack from Russia. Obviously, the pressures from sanctions, et cetera, are causing them to look for potentially opportunities to attack alternative sources that might support the West. Attacks on these sectors have occurred since the start of the war, but it appears the sector, as a vulnerable resource, as part of Canada's critical infrastructures, we're actually well prepared for them and have actually successfully defended the attacks that we have seen over the last 2 months. But attacks are actually quite different than successes. So there are actually a staggering number of attacks from all actors, state and stateless, on a daily basis, and they've been going on for years. If these were not appropriately defended, this would have been a serious problem long before the war itself. In fact, it has been a serious problem, and we've done a lot of things to try and protect ourselves. However, we don't know what we don't know. So there are something called zero-day attacks that could occur. These are unknown attacks from before. These can be launched at different times on us unsuspectingly because we're just not prepared for them. We don't know that they're out there, what these vulnerabilities are. But we haven't seen an increase of those over the last 2 months. And so likely if attacks were being launched at this point of unknown origin, then we would probably have had some kinds of cracks in the systems, but we haven't really seen that in the way that many people expected. Canada is making an investment through the CSIN program, and I think this is a key step in the right direction. It's a critical investment in Canada's current and future cybersecurity. This was initiated in 2019, long before this occurred. So the reality is that Canada has actually made some pretty good steps in the last little while in order to set itself on a very solid footing. What we really want to do is build some sort of a cyber safe ecosystem. Canada's critical infrastructure in general is vulnerable because it's built on legacy systems that are known to be particularly vulnerable. And what I mean by legacy systems are systems that were in existence before the Internet of Things actually started to occur. With the advent of the IoT and the need to replace old components with internet connected ones, we're actually opening up a potential threat and attack on some of our critical infrastructure. This is part of what's being investigated, both in terms of research and at the corporate level within the private sector. So large corporations, though, are actually likely to be reasonably well protected right now. The reality is lots of money has been invested by the private sector because they recognize their vulnerability, and so as a result, they've managed to move things forward quite a bit over the last 20 years. Small and medium-sized enterprises, however, are simply vulnerable to various attacks, and additional investment needs to be made to protect them in some sort of a way. However, they are likely not to be a specific target from Russia unless they exist in certain cybersecurity sectors and or are suppliers to the critical infrastructure. So the key issues, we have a critical shortage of experts in this area. Post-secondaries are trying to address that. We need to upskill and reskill existing workers. We have a lack of education and knowledge in the workforce and in the general public, and hiring international expertise might help, but it's unlikely to be sufficient simply because there's so much in demand. So with
Thank
that,
you very much.
I'm done.
You are perfect. Absolutely on the schnoz. Way to go. I now invite Ms. Juliette Kayyem to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes, whenever you're ready.
Novice mistake. Thank you for having me. And one of my former students is now an MP. Talib is in there. I can't see a thing, but it's a thrill to be here. Okay, so I want to, when I was asked to be here, I had made it clear because I wanted to be clear that the exact risk assessment for Canada is not something I'm an expert in. I'm an expert in what in our space and what I've worked on globally is what we call right of boom, which is essentially what are your nation, what are the capacities, especially in the cyber field, assuming that the bad thing is going to happen. So like Ken was saying, there's a lot of questions about the increased vulnerability for a country like Canada, given the Russian conflict. It is a big issue in my space, on the sort of preparation space, about why hasn't more been why haven't we seen more activity? The answers to that may be multiple, and the best ones we know so far is maybe much like military capacity, Russian cyber capacity to destroy as compared to disrupt, because disruptions we can handle. To destroy were overestimated. It could also be that the invocation of Article 5 by NATO might have had a disciplining effect, that the idea that if any attack on critical infrastructure which impacted individuals would have been viewed as an attack similar to a military attack. And so we don't know, and we're not done yet. So what does that mean for preparation for that? Overall, and I was just in Canada getting a briefing on this about 2 weeks ago, so it's a funny coincidence, but overall, much like the United States, Canada's focus and its private sector critical infrastructure focus has been on what we call left of boom capabilities. In other words, stopping some sort of infiltration, some sort of boom, so to speak. Those are important and those are essential. But what hasn't been done enough, especially in coordination with the United States and the northern states, is what would happen if there was a disruption. We measure success on whether you can stop more harm from occurring. In other words, how quickly can you respond? How quickly can you get systems back up? We're not success. We're not going to say, I guess put a different way, which is how. My standard is, can you make something less bad? And in the cyber critical infrastructure space, as Ken was describing, there's a tremendous amount of focus on the stopping the hack or the ransomware or the nation state, and less on what would you do if that were to happen? Do you have more than an on-off switch, right? Which is generally what these have. And there's lots of lessons learned so far because of this. We've learned this from Colonial Pipeline in the United States, which didn't have much capacity. A lot of it has to do with response time. Do you know when your system has been infiltrated, and how quickly can you protect yourself from what we call cascading losses? In other words, can Canada, even if there is a disruption or a destruction, something even greater, can you stop the cascading losses, and can you account or require the private sector to do that? What does cascading losses mean? It's just essentially there's the initial thing and then all the things that happen after the fact that could have been stopped if you had been able to manage the harm. The second is what sorts of regional planning has occurred. We certainly know in this space that there's no company acts alone, no locality acts alone. But in terms of regional planning and communication, we know that there is a need for greater understanding of what are the consequences of the vulnerability, not just what's the risk, not just what's the vulnerability, what are the consequences of the vulnerability. And then the third area where there's lacking is, I would say, sort of more communication. This is going to sound familiar, I think, across every country. More communication about whatever risk you are seeing in the government to the private sector, so it could begin to prepare
10 seconds, please.
Its consequence management capabilities. It's all about response when you cannot exactly measure what the risk is. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I would now like to invite Mr. David Shipley to make an opening statement of up to 5 minutes. Floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to the committee for the opportunity to be here. I'm going to talk about 3 key recommendations. The first is the need for mandatory incident reporting so we actually know what's happening left and right of boom. I'm going to talk about the need for standards and basic cyber hygiene to try and prevent the likelihood of incidents from happening. And third, I'm going to talk about the desperate need to help small and mid-sized businesses, the subnational public sector, healthcare, municipalities, and higher education secure themselves. My name is David Shipley, and I'm the co-founder and CEO of Beauceron Security. I have worked in cybersecurity for the past decade. I hold a Certified Information Security Manager designation from SECU, and I've spoken with Canadian media hundreds of times over the past decade about cyber attacks and social media manipulation. Beauceron serves nearly 600 customers ranging from North America's biggest banks to national telcos, governments, small business, and more. Our technology is used to educate more than 500,000 people to know more and care more about their role in cybersecurity. According to the 2022 Verizon Data Breach Incident Report, 82% of all cyber attacks succeed because of the human element of cyber, whether that's people falling for expert use of emotional manipulation in emails, known as phishing, or human error in the use or design of technology. The word cyber itself points to the importance of the human element. Cyber comes from the Greek word kybernetes, and it's focused on the relationship between people, technology, and control. A future where individuals, organizations, governments, and society are in control of the technology they rely on every day is a bright one for Canada. But that is not our dysfunctional present. Those who seek to harm Canada and its interests understand how to use technology and control harm. Russia's capability in this regard is well documented. They have developed the capability with state-backed hacking teams to cripple critical infrastructure, as been mentioned earlier, hack into political parties and governments to find and leak sensitive information, and more. They have cultivated a robust cybercrime industry and have relationships with organized criminal gangs to avoid accountability for their actions. Russia also understands the use of websites and social media platforms as a mean to control people with disinformation. Marcus Kolga with Macdonald Laurier Institute and others have well documented this. And social media manipulation is part of the spectrum of weapons when we talk about cyber conflict. Russia's actions in cyberspace have had severe consequences for Canadians. Cyber attacks from Russian criminal gangs have crippled Canadian municipalities, healthcare organizations, and more, with costs into the tens of millions of dollars. Cybersecurity firm Emisoft estimated there were more than 4,000 Canadian organizations victimized by ransomware alone in 2021, with estimated damages as high as $654 million. And while the Government of Canada has made significant efforts to protect itself from cyber threats, most of the risk to Canada is in the hand of the private sector or subnational public sector. To reduce that risk, we must get better insight into cyber attacks, improve our regulations on basic cyber hygiene, and increase our resources to our most vulnerable organizations. First, we must implement mandatory cyber incident reporting that goes beyond federally regulated industries and includes healthcare as well as vital supply chains, including manufacturing and food. We are lagging the United States and Europe in this respect. Most organizations are not going to voluntarily engage with the federal government during incidents. They are told by their legal and risk teams or by their insurer to limit information sharing and disclosure, as working with government is seen to offer limited gain and much to lose. This means we lose crucial insights into attacks on Canada, and even more importantly, the root causes and key lessons are not learned or shared effectively. Second, we need national mandatory cyber hygiene. Cybersecure Canada is a great start, but voluntary uptake will continue to be low. We need to take a lesson from the UK's similar programs and tie access to government procurement with achieving basic cybersecurity standards. Third, our most vulnerable sectors are the subnational public sectors such as higher ed, municipalities, and healthcare. They need dedicated funding from the federal government to improve their security as quickly as possible. On the private sector side, our small and mid-sized businesses desperately need help affording the security tools they need in an increasingly hostile environment. I would be remiss if I didn't comment on the need to regulate social media as an important part of our national cybersecurity strategy to put Canadians in control of the technology they use. Social media algorithms that amplify fear, anger, and hatred are tools highly leveraged by Russia and other enemies to fracture our society. We must give Canadians control back of the content they see by mandating the default view for social media be chronological order, not algorithmically decided, and require an opt-in model for algorithmic content.
10 seconds, please.
Failure to act today damns us to a future where our businesses are crippled from waves of foreign extortion attempts, our citizens and politics are poisoned with division and disinformation, and our ability to provide the essentials of life is significantly diminished.
Thank you very much, sir. And thank you all for your remarks. We now move into the first round of questions. Leading off will be Ms. Dancho with a 6-minute slot. Whenever you're ready, Ms. Dancho.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My first question is for Mr. Shipley. Thank you, and thank you to all the witnesses for being here and for Mr. Shipley being able to be here in person. I want to pick up on a few of the recommendations you had for the mandatory cyber hygiene. One that you mentioned that I picked up on was tying it to government procurement requirements. Do you have any others that you would recommend?
So the idea of tying it to government procurement came from the UK's Cyber Essential program, which is what some of our program was modeled after. And what they did was they dramatically improved their supply chain security for the UK national government. And then the benefit to the rest of the country is that they had a more secure SMB sector. So this is a great starting point. And we've seen the benefits of good hygiene, the efforts by Ukraine and the United States government to prepare for the conflict we now see significantly reduce the impact of Russia's efforts in that country. Good hygiene, good left of boom, saves us a lot of misery. I've been on the phone with a small and mid-sized business. It was a hardware store, and they've been ransomwared. And this was the worst 3 days of that owner's life. And it turned out to be weeks to fully recover. They were back to pen and paper. Had they only had more help and resources or an incentive to invest in security and help doing it, they could have avoided that bad day. And the last thing I'll mention about supply chain is you never know how a supply chain vulnerability will play out. It was tax software in Ukraine that led to the crippling in 2017 with the massive wiper malware called NotPetya. It's a small tax software firm. So small and mid-sized business can have an oversized impact. We just don't know how the combination comes out.
And can you give some examples of how we can, you mentioned the small hardware store, what role does government play to incentivize? What does that look like? Is that like a tax break? What would you imagine that could be?
48% of small businesses don't spend anything on cybersecurity today. So it could be in the form of tax credits, but it also took a look at models like CDAP, which is help with digital adoption, which is much needed in the pandemic. Unfortunately, that digital adoption actually has increased vulnerabilities for small and mid-sized business. So we need to tie being secure into grants and loans and other things that have a direct tie to businesses.
Thank you very much. I just have some questions now for Mr. Barker. You said recently on a podcast, I believe it's Cybersecurity Cubed, about the threat of quantum computing to our existing cybersecurity and cryptography networks. Can you provide some feedback to the committee of how Canada is performing in this sphere?
I probably need a bit more context for the question. The existential threat from quantum is probably a future one. It's not a current one, in the sense that it's actually a threat to the cryptographic systems that are in place that we currently use to actually operate all of our systems. So I'm trying to avoid getting too technical here. It is possible, in a future possibility, is that quantum computing could effectively undermine all modern encryption techniques, and shorten the lifespan, if you will, of how long something could be considered cryptographically safe. So that threat isn't current. It might be 10, 20 years away, to be blunt. Certainly people who champion quantum technology would argue that it could be just around the corner, and they're not wrong, but the reality is it's probably quite some distance in the future. The threat, though, is still real today, in the sense that if it's cracked in 20 years or 25 years, we would probably by that point have quantum safe cryptography available. But the existing stuff that's currently being secured by modern encryption 20 years from now becomes vulnerable. So if it's stored someplace in an encrypted way and we think it's safe for the next 2,000 years, it could become vulnerable at that point. And so all of that legacy encrypted data that we consider very secure at this point could become very vulnerable at that point. And much of it could have been released or hacked into and be sitting out someplace. And so it could become vulnerable at that stage. So I'm not sure if I've actually answered the core of your question, but it's a very complicated one.
Yes, no, I think you've given us all a bit of a crash course on this complex issue. Are any of our adversaries really aggressively pursuing this? Are they investing in this? Have you heard if they're discussing this? Like you mentioned, it could be 10 years, 20 years, 25 years that all of our encrypted technologies could be at risk of quantum computing from adversaries. But should we be having these discussions now, or is it just a bit too early?
No, I think we should be having these discussions now, because the mechanisms that we might want to put in place 20 years from now are going to take 20 years to develop. And so we're talking about doing fundamental research and development efforts. And Canada, in many ways, is leading in this space. We made investments several years ago that were critical to promoting quantum. But I will say that the rest of the world is starting to catch up. And so I think there's an opportunity here for us to actually be world leaders in that particular space. And that will obviously help protect our cybersecurity.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
I would now like to turn to Mr. Noor Mohammed with a 6-minute block of questions. The floor is yours, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses for being with us today. And in particular, to my old professor, Professor Kime, it's good to see you. And I'd like to, if I could, kick off with a couple of questions to you, please. You talked about disruption and destruction, and the fact that we can handle disruption, and destruction is a kind of a different, sort of whole different ballgame. My concern is one of the challenges that we've been dealing with is that when we look at the impact of Russian bots in terms of spreading misinformation, first, spreading COVID misinformation, trying to sow sort of this misinformation, this idea of sort of breaking down kind of trust in public institutions. And then we saw proximity of that narrative to sort of far-right extremist kind of views. And then, lo and behold, a connection to very pro-Russian, anti-Ukrainian kind of messaging online. I'm wondering whether or not this erosion in sort of the public perception of policy actually starts to move into that realm of destruction in a way that perhaps we haven't thought about. And I'd love your thoughts on that, because it's something that in Canada certainly we are starting to see, and it's something that I think all of us here are quite concerned about.
I think that's right. I mean, is that okay? I think you're exactly right in terms of a not every crisis is a disaster. I mean, in other words, we can, if we're built for it, at least in any type of attack, you can, if built for it, survive something. But if you're prepared for it, it becomes, in the words that I'm quoting the NATO language, at least, destructive if you cannot manage even the smaller things, because they just sort of build on each other. That's just the notion of cascading losses, that if you cannot stop the harm as close to the vulnerability, though you don't even know what those impacts will be downstream, right? And especially in the cyber context, which is what we've experienced with critical infrastructure here in the United States. Simple ransomware attacks, say Colonial Pipeline, really simple, like just not that sophisticated, simply because they did not have a response capability, meant that the whole system was down for a week. That's not sophisticated. So one of the ways to think about the relationship between just, I think as a nation, as a government, you're really focused on, from Russia, on the destructive stuff. And I think NATO made that clear in their language, that, and they're not going to define what the difference is between a disruptive attack and a destructive attack. I think that's been good. In other words, I think that is actually keeping enough vagueness in the system so that the adversary doesn't know where the line is, right? Because the last thing you want to do is say, okay, this, we would view this as destructive and this is only disruptive. So I think that the best response is the universe. I mean, this is now not rocket science world. I think the fact that we talk about cybersecurity or cyber attacks makes it seem technological. On the response side, it's really not that sophisticated, or it's not that you don't need to know coding, and a lot of it is communication, systems that have multiple defenses, systems that stop the cascading losses, in other words, are bifurcated or divided, regional support systems that actually can essentially serve as mutual aid. So if an energy system went down, you could essentially share it with, get systems from others. So those are just tried and true emergency management capabilities. And I've spent a lot of years trying to focus the cybersecurity world on, you don't have to reinvent the wheel, that a lot of what we've learned for both the disruptive and destructive attacks is already known.
So just building on that, as we think about the world of cyber, which for whatever reason people still see as overly complex, and perhaps it isn't as complicated as you articulate as we perceive it to be. When you look at what has been happening in the United States, and you look at sort of where Canada resides on that spectrum, and then we think about the context of what you said in terms of Russia's sort of inability to prosecute a ground war well, and arguably either their inability or sort of lack of desire to prosecute an online sort of war right now. What should we be thinking about in terms of Russia? Are there things that we, the West, are missing in terms of where the next thing might come from? And if so, can you share some of your thoughts on that, and where should we be pointing our attention so that we're as best prepared as we can be?
So I don't even want to say I can pretend to know sort of what the strategy is, but now we're in the sort of long slog. Unfortunately, we're likely to be in some long slog, we being, the Ukrainians, with the support from both of our countries, into a long slog that is less transparent because it's not in the major cities. So we'll just, all of media, the US, the Canadians, we will all get less interested in it. So one area that, in terms of vulnerabilities, one area is that simply, we get back to the age in which there's no discipline, the era where there was no disciplining impact, and
10 seconds, please.
Ransomware and others actors are able to to run freely, utilizing Russia and its capabilities. So it may look less state-sponsored, but it is state-sponsored.
Thank you very much. Ms. Michaud, I now turn to you for a 6-minute block of questions whenever you're ready.
Merci, Monsieur le Président.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, witnesses, for your presence. I'll continue with you, Ms. KM. I'll read in English some criticism or an article from the Washington Examiner about your book, The Devil Never Sleeps. And it says in this book,
Government and private sector leaders should no longer focus all their attention and resources on disaster prevention. Instead, they must learn how to plan accordingly and use all available tools to minimize the negative consequences when disaster does arrive. Entre autres, vous dites qu'on aurait...
So you're saying we should have been able to anticipate what would happen in relation to Russia's activities in Ukraine, and that these issues should have been examined closely, how we should counter them. You were talking about putting less emphasis on prevention. So I would just like to hear you a bit further along those lines. We've heard several experts say Canada wasn't sufficiently ready to face these cyber threats compared to other countries, the Five Eyes, for example. So how could Canada have been better prepared against a giant such as Russia that could threaten our basic infrastructure?
Thank you for that question. And in some ways, the limitations that exist before a war, such as your capacity, your access to intelligence, will exist even during it. Well, thank you for the mention of the book. I will say I've spent 25 years in what we call all hazards. Which is essentially, I'm not looking solely at cybersecurity. I'm looking at the vulnerabilities that nations like yours and mine have. I've been working a lot on the notion of a North American regional response capacity in cyber and climate change, because the kinds of attacks that we're seeing now and the kinds of vulnerabilities we're seeing now are going to take a combined U.S., Mexico, Canadian focus, just given our capacity. So this focus on not worrying less, but that we need to focus our sense of success on whether we can respond and minimize the harm is particularly true in this space, and something that I would urge you to push on the private sector, which has essentially, this is probably a little crude, but has essentially focused almost all of their security efforts on left of boom. I mean, in other words, if we can stop the breach, we'll try to stop bad things from happening as I like to put it, that will stay on the left side of the boom. So one thing that can be pushed is, what are their response planning? What sort of tabletops if you have the cyber attack? And then the most important thing I'm going to leave you with is the bifurcation of cybersecurity that's happened in your country and my country, and physical security has to be remedied somehow, because as we see in all of these attacks, there's really no such thing as a cyber attack anymore. It is a cyber and physical attack. And what's happened in a lot of these companies, as I know you're aware of, and what's happened even in some of our government institutions, is the cybersecurity apparatus has been built, and the physical security apparatus, the traditional, what we say, gates, guns, and guards, as we call it, both those apparatuses have been built, and there's not a lot of synergies between them if there is in fact a cyber attack. And I think we have to really push that on the private sector. There's always going to be physical consequences. These are rarely just issues about privacy or private information or reputation anymore. The adversary wants there to be disruptions, and worse, even destructions.
So for my time left, a quick question to Professor Baker. You're specialized in informatics and data to protect confidentiality. In 22, 1922 document, how Canada can adapt to a deteriorating security environment. A report by the Task Force on National Security. This was published by Ottawa University, was urging the government to think about the creation of a top secret cloud and the government-wide. Some allies have done so before us in different, there would be vast quantities of data stored in different organizations in a way that can concretely protect these data against cyber attacks. What do you think about this idea of coming up with a top secret cloud to store confidential government information? Do you think it's a good way to protect ourselves against some forms of cyber attacks, at least?
So I will challenge the question a little bit first. I don't know what a top secret cloud is. If a cloud is a shared resource that people have access to for lots of good reasons, in order to make that top secret, you've got to do it with access control. And access control is basically just a system where your top secret data is stored, and you limit the access to it in some way. Thus, I don't actually think that the vocabulary is maybe populist, but it's not the right vocabulary.
Thank you very much. Mr. McGregor, over to you for a 6-minute slot. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Professor Kayam, I'd like to start with you. I actually wish we had you here before our last meeting, because our previous meeting was with Emergency Preparedness Minister Bill Blair. And, we had, as a committee, the opportunity to question him on his role because, as you're aware, the Department of Public Safety and Emergency Preparedness was split. So we now have two ministers responsible for those two respective areas. And so a lot of what you've been talking about, when I look at the minister's mandate letter for emergency preparedness, you can read it there online, but our committee ultimately wants to table a report with specific recommendations. Looking at what our Minister for Emergency Preparedness is responsible for, is there anything that you would like to see in that report to see the minister specifically focus on?
So there's two areas I would focus on, and given my understanding, which is not as deep as yours. I think the first is the cross-border emergency management capacity. If there is a cyber attack, say in Detroit, the auto industry, the OEMs, whatever, what capacity, what communications, what structures are in place that are going to essentially, treat it as a borderless response, because it has to be. It's going to impact both countries. It's going to impact, as we've seen with some of the protests recently, it will impact border crossings, our capacity to move across the border. So primarily that would be one. The other thing in terms of what the mandate should be for the emergency manager, because I agree with you. I think the distinction between public safety and emergency management can be hard at times, but two requirement, or I guess one requirement, which is what is the minister requiring in terms of what we call in my space all hazards response. In other words, you can't just focus on what the cyber response is going to be. It's going to have all sorts of impacts. The same is true of climate. The same is true of a terror attack. The consequences are going to be generally the same. And I sometimes think, and I know you certainly do in this, in the way the government is structured, in the way the ministries are structured, we sort of put information security off to the side, right, and sort of protecting our networks. And I would just get much more forceful in terms of what reviews are being conducted, what capacity, or what would be the consequences physically of a cyber attack on, major industry, and then what are we doing to close that gap between information security and physical security. I will tell you, I advise a lot of companies now to not have chief information security officers, chief security officers and to just have chief preparedness officers now, because it's too hard to figure out what the risk might be.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Shipley, I'd like to turn to you. Can we make any recommendations? I mean, what kind of investments are there in the field of deterrence? Is that something? Can we make people who are potentially considering a cyber attack, whatever form it may be, are there good defensive options? I'm just thinking of the old adage that the best defense is a good offense. You know, is that kind of capability being developed?
I don't have specific insight into what CSE's operations are. We do know that legislative powers were granted, and the ability to conduct operations has now begun. It's
Does
very.
it exist in the private sector then that you are aware of?
We absolutely do not want the private sector shooting back, because first of all, attribution's really hard. And I ran cybersecurity for a university. We got hacked all the time, and we were used as a platform to attack government entities, private sector entities, et cetera. If someone started shooting back at my university because we were the originating source from their perspective, they wouldn't be actually hitting the end target. It's a fun little shell game. So attribution is really hard. Private sector absolutely should not be shooting back. That should be a sole responsibility of the federal government, and it should be exercised. I think the challenge from a policy standpoint is what's policing and what's military. And we need better clarity on that, and we do need to flex. It's important that government actually speak forcefully about this. So we saw this with the Biden administration after critical infrastructure attacks in the United States. It was straight from the top. Don't mess with us. Who is the minister that actually is going to respond here in Canada?
And on when you mentioned the mandatory incident reporting, we have seen problems through other studies that we've conducted, whether it's on ideologically motivated violent extremism, on our firearms study. When you don't have the appropriate range of data, you make poor decisions at the top. So if you want to just expand on that, like how important that is so that we, I guess, have a full picture of the range of threats that are coming at us and can deploy our resources appropriately.
So my greatest concern right now is the threat to Canada's healthcare sector. Obviously, we're still in the pandemic. We're still recovering it. When a hospital goes down, and it goes down for weeks, cancer patients don't get timely care, other surgeries are delayed, et cetera. And we don't have good information sharing in this country. So we've had multiple hits. We had an entire provincial system hit badly, and we don't have those lessons shared out.
10 seconds, please.
Imagine we had airplane crashes and we didn't investigate them or share the lessons learned. Well, you're going to get more airplane crashes.
Yeah, thank you for that.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, we now move into a second round of questions. To lead off, I'll call on Mr. Lloyd for a 5-minute block. Sir, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question is going to be to Mr. Shipley, specifically on Russian disinformation. And I get concerned that sometimes we have partisan blinders on in this committee because this is not just a far-right phenomenon. Would you agree that the Russians will and have exploited actors across the whole political spectrum to advance their agenda?
We've seen evidence of that from the United States and others. The objective can just simply to put each other at each other's throats, left, right, et cetera. They don't care. As long as we don't trust each other, don't communicate, can't politic, and our democracy looks like it doesn't work, then their system looks legitimate and their aims are achieved. So it's about paralyzing us. I mean, now what frightens me is that there's some evidence that some of the trucker groups in Canada were actually being influenced by content farms that just wanted to sell crappy T-shirts and hats. And so our democracy's been torn apart so someone can sell anti-prime ministerial T-shirts.
Now, one really compelling case, we saw on the eve of Moscow's invasion of Ukraine, we saw members of parliament from the left of center saying that Canada should not support Ukraine because it is a fascist state. That was being said. Would you consider, that is parroting Russian propaganda, and it was all the way into Canada's parliament. Would you agree that, that was a significant a case of disinformation?
I'm not familiar with the specific instances of that, but just based on what you're saying, we've had warnings from our intelligence agencies talking about influence operations against MPs of all stripes from various nationalities that have interests, whether it's Russia, China, et cetera. This is part of the game, and this is what they try to do. whether to score points to try and keep us disengaged in this conflict or whatever national aim. That's part of it, and it's part of the importance of educating MPs and politicians about protecting themselves. One of the things that concerns me is how protected our political parties are in general from cyber operations, influence operations. The hack of the Democratic National Committee in the States lays bare that what happens when a party isn't secure can have dramatic impacts on a country's course. So,
thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to put it on the record, like, have you seen evidence about how the Russian Ukrainians are Nazi narrative has been used to create fear amongst left of center political groups across the world and possibly in Canada? Like, has that been something that has been observed?
I think there's been reporting covering attempts to, I mean, it makes complete logical sense. How do you keep Canada to the fight and get as many people on each side? I've seen right of center folks saying this isn't our fight. Why do we care about what's happening? Left of center folks saying, well, there's Nazis and fascists. So it's just about muddying the waters. And the problem is we live in a post-truth era. And we have to work on that. There has to be truth still out there.
I appreciate putting that on the record. I'm going to shift over to Professor Kayam. In your excellent work on this issue of domestic security, I'm very concerned about electromagnetic pulses. Now, this might be open fact, but I want your opinion. Is a nuclear explosion in the atmosphere can have very little kinetic effect on the ground, but could have a devastating effect on our electronics? Would this be considered a violation of Article 5 and would require a NATO response?
So I really think NATO and the Biden administration have been really brilliant in this in terms of new threats, right? Which is they're not actually looking at specifically at the threat. So if you take cyber or what you mentioned or electromagnetic field or disruption, which is they're not looking to they're looking at the consequences. And so they were early on making a distinction. It took a while for me to figure out what they were doing because they weren't quite transparent about it, where they were look, there's disruptions in the world and we'll accept those disruptions for the price of doing business. In other words, because we're connected, because the internet works, because we need our electronics, we're always going to assume that there's some level of vulnerability. Okay, but there's a moment where, and that those will be disrupted because people just behave poorly. Those aren't reasons to go to war.
So an electronic magnetic pulse would be a reason, you think?
If it disrupts, and the standard is, does it disrupt civilian capability to live? I mean, in other words, will a mother have not be able to feed her children?
I only have 10 seconds. Would you recommend that we do more to protect ourselves from electronic magnetic pulses? Thank you.
Yes. Yeah. Almost anything I do.
Thank you very much. Ms. Demoff, over to you for 5 minutes whenever you're ready.
Thank you, and thank you to all of our witnesses for your testimony today. I actually want to follow up on a comment that my colleague, Mr. Lloyd, was talking about, and misinformation and disinformation campaigns. Professor Kayama, this is directed towards you. They do tend to target pre-existing social and political divides in an attempt to divide us even more. And we're seeing that more and more. And I'm just wondering, do you have any recommendations to the government to ensure that we're treating this threat properly and adequately, and any recommendations on steps that we can take to both recognize that what's happening, but also to counter it?
Yeah. So, and this has been hugely contested in the United States. A recent attempt to create a oversight body dealing with disinformation sort of fell apart almost immediately when it was attacked, a new entity within the Department of Homeland Security. And sometimes I think we make it just not too hard, but we now know what works. Reliable voices from I'll go back to this, but reliable voices from the government that are actually addressing the myth misinformation. And I think for a long time, our governments thought no one could possibly believe that, right? But if you actually come out early and, whether it's called a mythbuster, but at FEMA, they have something called Mythbusters, which is a way, our Federal Emergency Management Agency, a way to just combat the rumors that go on during any crisis, right? So that's first. The second is consistent. We say in crisis management, sort of consistent numbers and hope. In other words, government spokespeople have to provide facts consistently. They can't go into hiding. And then, what are you doing to make things better, right? Hope is always important. The third is, and I think we're learning a lot from Ukraine, is we used to think that our governments were in a passive mode to this misinformation, like, oh, Russia's doing this and we have nothing. Actually, I think the successes of Canada, US, and other countries in calling out what we knew Russia to be doing early and often, I think very much changed the battlefield, literally, in the effort against Russia. It prepared the Ukrainians, it prepared us, it prepared you all. So I do think there are some excellent lessons learned out of the counterattack of the misinformation coming out solely just of the Ukraine war. And I think talking about after actions, I think it's something that we should study, because we don't need to be passive anymore. We always thought that was the best response, was just move on. It is not.
So I just want to follow up on something that you said, because you said reliable voices from the government, except that part of these misinformation campaigns are discrediting the government.
Yeah.
So how do you get people to trust what a government is saying when part of the campaign, and it's not just government, it's all of our institutions, are part of this disinformation campaign?
So what we found, I mean, it's a great question. And in some ways, we'll never get to perfect. So, I live in a world where, less bad is my standard. So we still have 19% unvaccinated in the United States. That's not a great number. But given a lot of the misinformation, it's not as bad as I had worried before. So in some ways, I think we were able to capture. So when I say government, though, it's not simply at the national level. If you look at COVID specifically, one of the ways to overcome vaccine reluctance based on misinformation was very much a local-based communication strategy that in our case, the Dr. Fauci had lost his ability to be persuasive amongst a pool of people. That's okay, that happens, and that you pivot to much more localized spokespeople.
I only have about 30 seconds left, so I might give it back to you in order to allow my colleagues to have the time to finish close to 1.
Okay, then we'll move to Ms. Michaud. You have 2.5 minutes, and then we'll go to Mr. McGregor with 2.5 minutes, and that will take us to the end of the session.
Okay.
Ms. Michaud.
Merci, Monsieur.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I have a question for you, Mr. Shipley. And the incident that took place in Sunwing a few weeks ago, it showed importance of reporting cyber attacks, and you said in an article that Canada should follow the example of the United States that approved a few months ago an act that requires organizations in critical infrastructure to report all events to the Homeland Security within 72 hours following discovering an attack, or 24 hours following the payment of a ransom. That might be a good way to assist small or major enterprises, those that manage critical infrastructure. Could that assist countries such as Canada?
We are lagging getting incident reporting in place. Now we have Canadian organizations that are going to be telling the United States what's potentially happening to them, and we're completely in the dark. So the push to start with federally regulated industries, so transportation, banking, energy, telecommunications, that's good. But where the pain is often outside of those federally regulated industries. So what Europe has done is set certain size thresholds. So what size business has a meaningful impact on the economy, and then set thresholds for participation and reporting on that. So I think that's important, because a small and mid-sized business, or in the case of Sunwing, it was their IT provider for their ticketing system that got got hit in the U.S. It wasn't Sunwing that got hit. It was the IT provider. And so how do we get the lessons learned? How do we share them so we can find and fix vulnerabilities and learn lessons? And we have to move beyond blame culture in cyber. This organization was a victim. Why were they a victim? How can we learn from that? And how, for example, for our hospitals, how can 100 other hospitals not get hit after we have one hit, so we get better?
Merci.
Thank you. Very little time left, but maybe I'll talk about the issue in Costa Rica, a much smaller country than Canada, but for some weeks they have declared a state of emergency because they were invaded by a Russian hacking group. I think the Minister of Finance, Health, Labor, that are completely paralyzed by this attack. Should we fear a similar attack in Canada, or do you think we are sufficiently prepared and protected?
Russian ransomware gangs attack us. We need to get better at it. And cryptocurrency, the flow of money, is fueling this problem.
Yeah.
Thank you. Mr. McGregor, over to you for the last 2.5 minutes of this session. Over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Shipley, when you were talking about the relationship that Russia has cultivated with criminal organizations, it kind of reminded me of, a few centuries ago when England cultivated a relationship with privateers to basically do its dirty business for it. But like on the mandatory incident reporting, like going beyond federally regulated industries, and I know like the federal government has its relationship with the provinces, even with the Federation of Canadian Municipalities, so those subnational governments. But when it comes to the private sector, I guess what I want to know is, are there potential, I agree with you that this is important, but often when criminal organizations are holding a company hostage, one of their biggest threats are, if you go to the police, we're going to come after you. How do we bypass that specific threat? Because I guess that's what has made private companies loath to go to the authorities, because that is a very real threat to their organization.
Well, so barriers for companies reporting. Number one, the insurance companies often say, we're running the response to this breach, cheaper for us to pay out the ransom. You're not involving the police. Shut up. If you're a publicly traded company, this could affect share price. The lawyers get super wired about this. So we have to change the risk equation. It has to be, you need to report or you face consequences. And all of a sudden, legal, insurers, and others saying, oh, we got to bring CSE and others into the fold. And you change the relationship. The criminals know that we have laws that say they're going to call us. Then maybe they're going to move on somewhere else. And I'm with Dr. Kayam about, I'm in the world of doing better, not getting it perfect. And I'd like Canada. The old expression in New Brunswick was, my dad used to joke, you don't have to outrun the bear, I just got to outrun you. Same applies in cyber. Like we just got to get incrementally better about doing that. So mandatory reporting changes the equation, and we need it. And if we go this road of provincial, you're going to have not secure provinces and secure provinces. And is that the kind of country? This is a national security issue. And we have to deal with it. We're too small to deal with this without centralizing it. So we have to.
Yeah, well, the fact that it's criminal, we have authority over the criminal law, and it's often originating from outside of province's boundaries, so that means the federal government does have jurisdiction. But writing it into insurance
You've got the last
contracts,
word, Mr. McGregor.
But I'll leave it there. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
You've got the last word. I'd like to thank the witnesses very much for sharing your expertise and the body of knowledge that you've accumulated over years. And maybe you go back 25 or 30 years, but this is timely and current and very much a part of today. And on behalf of this committee and all parliamentarians, I want to thank you for your time and for your insight and your wisdom. Colleagues, that is the end of this portion of the meeting and the meeting itself. Have a good day, everybody. In another couple of days, we will resume on Thursday. The meeting is adjourned. Thank you.